Welcome to the From Harm to Healing podcast. I'm your host, Chris Jones, and I'm a therapist who runs the From Harm to Healing treatment program, an online program for men who have engaged in infidelity or compulsive sexual behaviors within the context of an intimate relationship. I started this podcast to illuminate some of the common blind spots within the treatment fields for compulsive sexual behavior or sex addiction through the lens of the deceptive sexuality trauma model. I hope you find this resource enlightening, particularly if you're somebody navigating the pain of betrayal and deception for yourself. Thank you for listening to the From Harm to Healing podcast. One of the ideas that's come up many times in the different episodes, some I've done by myself, some I've done with Dr. Minwala, is the idea of reality or authentic reality, the importance of that word, reality, in this model. The idea of the partner's reality having been manipulated. And that's where we get this idea of, or this metaphor of, the secret sexual basement from. There is an intentional separation between the reality going on in the home above and the reality of what's actually going on underneath in the basement. And we have these two acronyms that you'll perhaps now be familiar with from these various episodes of IMR and IAR. So intentionally manipulated reality and intentionally accurate, authentic reality. So the intentionally manipulated reality referring to that idea of the separation between the two. There is an intentional manipulation happening. And then the idea that in recovery, for the men doing this work, one of the central goals is to be moving from IMR to IAR. So moving from that manipulated reality towards intentionally accurate, authentic reality. And as we've highlighted previously, that IAR, those two words in there, accurate and authentic, are both really important. They aren't overlapping, they are unique in their own right. And so accurate refers to true information, accuracy of information, that someone is telling the truth about what has happened. And then authentic or authenticity refers to the genuine, honest expression of who the person is, of what is going on for them, of their thoughts, of their feelings. So one is about external information, in a sense, and one is about the internal reality, the ego experience of the person. And generally speaking, when we're thinking about someone maintaining a secret sexual basement over a long period of time, both of those things are going to have significant deficits. There's obviously a deficit in accurate information, the truth of what is really happening, but there's so often going to be a deficit in authentic expression as well, the true expression of what is going on for the person, because they are so often living a suppressed or compartmentalized life. And so whilst this is somewhat of a repeat of principles we've already spoken about, I wanted to zoom in a little bit more on this idea of authenticity. We rightfully give a huge amount of focus, particularly early in the work, to accuracy. A lot of that is the integrity abuse work, the treatment around that part of the model, moving towards telling the truth, even things like disclosure, which I've spoken about recently. So the telling of accurate information, the telling of the truth, becomes an absolutely critical foundation. But in and of itself, that isn't enough for true health, true safety in a relationship. There also needs to be that authenticity. And authenticity in many ways is a deeper journey, a deeper, perhaps longer, perhaps more difficult journey in some ways, but again is ultimately needed for safety. If you are in an intimate relationship with someone and you ultimately don't really know who they are, what their internal reality is, you might know accurate information about what they've done now, but if you do not know who that person really is, it is going to be often almost impossible to have a real sense of safety in the relationship, especially given that that person has hurt you in the past, has brought tremendous pain and trauma to you. And one of the things that can unfortunately happen in this kind of recovery work is we understandably and rightfully start by focusing on the CES, or the sexual acting out behaviors. We then focus on integrity abuse, reducing the deception, moving towards accurate reality. But often the man in recovery doing this work can then end up in a place where they are still suppressing so much of who they are. They are focusing purely on not acting out, on following boundaries, on telling the truth. But their way of using their voice really is still hampered. There's an inability to perhaps authentically share their needs, their wants, their feelings, their fears, what's going on internally for them. And this can be very understandable because often, particularly early in the recovery journey, there isn't a lot of space for that, or hearing those things can be very triggering for the partner or frustrating to hear. And so, again, with good intention, we can still end up in a situation where, yes, accurate reality is being shared, or certainly a lot more accurate reality, but the authenticity of who that person is, there still isn't, for whatever reason, there isn't space for that, or there isn't a expression of that within the relationship. And so I come back to this idea that it's very difficult to build true long-term safety in that regard. A degree of safety can come from disclosures and check-ins and, again, the accurate information. But a higher degree in the long term of safety can come from knowing who I am in relationship with, knowing when that person is struggling, knowing what their fears are, knowing what their needs are, their wants, their desires, all of these things that make up so much of what a human being is. And I did a previous episode where I talked about power differential or power imbalance. And one of the things that's interesting is when this dynamic is happening, sometimes the guy can feel one down in the sense that there's no space for my thoughts, my feelings, my needs. But ironically, it can still feel, or it can still very much be, a power imbalance actually against the partner, because the partner might still feel like things are being held back, or avoidance is happening, or stonewalling, or those kinds of things. And so again, it can still feel very disempowering for the partner, even if the guy is, again, following the boundaries, is not acting out, all of those things. There can still be that sense of he is one up because there's this whole internal reality that I'm not getting access to. I don't know who I'm in relationship with. And ultimately, as I'm highlighting there, you will often have very different perspectives on that. So I can think of individuals I work with where I have spoken to their partner, or couples that I work with, and you will hear the guy sharing that there is no space for my thoughts and feelings, what's going on for me in this relationship. That is not welcome. But then I will equally hear that person's partner saying he still isn't able to authentically share what's going on for him. He's still hiding what's really going on underneath, who he really is. And so this is one of the great challenges that needs to be navigated clinically, especially when we're focusing on that relational plate, looking at how the relationship can move forward. And it's something that Dr. Minwala touched on, especially in those episodes about the attending work, developing those attending skills around when is the time for, again, the men I work with to be listening, to be holding space, to be an empathic witness, where it's not about what's going on for me necessarily in that moment. It's about holding, being a container for what's going on for my partner. And then when are the times outside of that, or how are the ways relationally that I can also be authentically sharing who I am, not in a justifying way, not in a passive-aggressive way or anything like that, but in an authentic way, illuminating my partner to my internal world. Being able to discern when that is welcome, where are the places for that. Again, it's a really important skill to be able to develop in this work. But I will maintain that ultimately it's a crucial skill to develop if we want to have a chance of moving into healthy relationship, if we want to have those true foundations of safety and trust that we can build upon. And then another thing I want to highlight when we're talking about this topic of authentic reality is this idea that, yes, we can tell someone You need to use your voice authentically. You need to share your internal authentic reality. But that is ultimately making the assumption that that person actually knows what is going on internally. And that's another way that I think we get stuck with this. We make the assumption that someone has that language available to them and is unwilling to share it, when so often it's the case that there really isn't that intimacy with the self or self-contact. There really isn't that deeper connection with thoughts, feelings, needs, wants, desires, all of those things. And that brings us back to those earlier episodes on the 3 I's, the integrity, intimacy, integration. And if you remember, if you've listened to them, the second one, intimacy, that was not about primarily intimacy with others. That was about the idea of developing intimacy with the self, picking up the phone to the self, checking in with the self, knowing what I'm thinking, knowing what I'm feeling. And so beyond the initial foundation of the treatment work around the CES behaviors, or the acting out, and the integrity abuse behaviors, and the accurate reality, the deeper work, the longer term work, the foundation of it all in so many ways, are these 2 principles of intimacy with the self, or self-contact, and then using the human voice, using the voice authentically, as we talked about previously in the episode on the voice with Dr. Minwala. So if I were to highlight 2 principles that are the most important in this work, again, beyond the basics of the CES and IAD plans, it would be, am I growing in intimacy with the self, in self-contact? And am I growing in my ability to authentically use the voice? So in a sense, it's about being intimate with the self, and then being able to connect and be intimate with others using the voice. That is the heart of what it is to be in authentic reality. That is also, therefore, one of the foundations of all of the group work I do, the From Harm to Healing treatment program, whether it's stage 1, 2, or 3. We're always starting with that foundation of intimacy with the self, using the voice, authentic reality. And everything really flows out of that. And so in the rest of the time I have in this episode today, I thought it might be good to actually lead us through the introduction that I sometimes do for those groups. We can think of it almost like a meditation, a way of really trying to be intentional about moving from what we call ordinary space to extraordinary space, really getting us all as a group to focus on the conditions we need to provide, the conditions we want to be true of the time we have together in order to be able to do this work in a deep way. So we'll start by marking that transition from ordinary to extraordinary by simply taking a breath together. So on the count of 3, 1, 2, 3, inhale and exhale. There are 3 words we want to think about as we start the meeting: approach, transition, and conditions. So approach, what is it that we are approaching when we do this work? We are approaching, through the lens of this DST model, an abuse victim trauma reality. And they are painful, heavy, impactful words to sit with: abuse, victim, trauma. And so when we're approaching those words, when we're approaching this story, we want to do so with intention. And we want to do so in what we call extraordinary space. We don't turn up to make small talk about these topics, to joke about them. We turn up with intention. And so we have the approach and then the transition. And as we just did, that is the simple use of the breath, a rhythm, a ritual of our intention to move into that space. And then that third word, conditions. So we want to think, what are the conditions we need to be able to do this work, to be able to face up to and sit with that abuse, victim, trauma reality? We can think of things like integrity, each of us showing up to the group with integrity. Safety or adequate safety. We might never feel fully safe doing this work, but we can provide an adequate level of safety as a group. And then humility, such an important condition for us to consider. Can we show up with the humility that we are here to learn, we are here to sit with, we are here to grow, but we cannot fix, we cannot make this go away. So humility becomes a foundational condition for us. And then we can think about honor and the idea of honoring the fact that each of us is here in this group, creating this space right now. And honor can be an interesting word to sit with doing this work, because we're approaching a story that might bring up a lot of guilt, a lot of shame, a lot of hurt for us. We might be reflecting on the hurt we have caused through this story. But I think it is right to hold a sense of honor for ourselves, to humanize ourselves as we willingly approach this work, as we choose to sit here and look at this story, as we choose to do these difficult tasks and talk about these difficult things. We can also hold a sense of honor for each other person in the group, honoring their voice, holding space for their voice, honoring their story, honoring where our stories overlap, but also where they're unique. And then finally, we can also honor the emotions that come up for us as we do this work, remembering that it is normal and to be expected for all sorts of emotions to come up as we talk about these things. We might be used to suppressing emotions, pushing uncomfortable emotions away, pretending they're not there. We might notice a tendency to judge emotions, think of them as feelings that we should or shouldn't have, or that are or aren't appropriate. But actually, we can learn to just honor what comes up for us. We don't need to pretend it's not there. We also don't need to necessarily react based upon those emotions, but we can honor them by becoming curious, by sitting with them, and through that, by learning something about ourselves. In many ways, emotions are the language of the self, and so we can learn so much about ourselves when we become curious about what comes up. And that goes for defenses as well. We can be curious about the defenses that might come up through our time in this group together. We don't have to react based upon them, but again, we don't have to pretend they're not there and suppress them or push them away. We can voice them, we can be curious about them. So underneath all of this, we have this simple idea of, what am I thinking? What am I feeling? What am I thinking? What am I feeling? Being curious about the self, what is coming up in you throughout the group meeting today, whether it's when you're sharing, when others are sharing, or even in the silences. What are you thinking and what are you feeling? And through that process, are you growing in intimacy with the self? Are you growing in your knowledge of who you really are? And so that is our first key principle. Self-contact, intimacy with the self. Out of there, all of the other work flows. And then our second key principle is the use of the voice, the human voice, which is such a powerful instrument, but is one that is so easy to take for granted, to use flippantly, to use without much thought. But we know as we do this work, as we learn about the harmful impacts of deceptive sexuality, that the voice is actually at the center of that. The voice in many ways has been one of the principal tools of harm when we think about integrity abuse, deception, lying, manipulation. And we know great harm is caused by those things. People around us are disempowered by deception, by manipulation of reality. Great harm is caused. That is what happens when a voice is used as a tool of intentionally manipulated reality. So our second key principle is moving from IMR to intentionally accurate, authentic reality, to develop the voice as an instrument for actual, accurate, authentic reality. We can think of it like a muscle that needs to be exercised. It might be new to be using the voice in this way, to be sharing accurately about what we've done and authentically about who we are. When we can use the voice in that way, it becomes a way to share, and to share of who we really are, rather than sharing the mask that we're hiding behind. It becomes a way to connect, and to connect based on actual reality. It is a way that we can provide conditions within the relationship where healing might be possible. And ultimately, it is empowering to both ourselves and people around us. And we need to remember that the truth isn't always easy. Sometimes the truth leads to difficult conversations, difficult reactions. Sometimes the truth is very difficult to share. It leads to consequences. But do we believe that ultimately it is empowering to be in reality rather than disempowering, like manipulated reality? People are empowered by having access to the truth, empowered to make fully informed decisions, empowered to know who they are in relationship with. And then finally, we can remember that it takes great courage and vulnerability to use the voice authentically. The truth can be uncomfortable. We can feel very vulnerable when we open ourselves up like that. But ultimately, we want to choose voice over violence, truth over manipulation. And so this is the challenge to each of us today as we meet. Can we show up in this extraordinary space in self-contact, curiosity with the self, and the courage to use the voice authentically in the time we have together? Thank you for listening to this episode of the From Harm to Healing podcast. If you'd like to find out more information about the deceptive sexuality trauma model itself, you can visit minwalamodel.com. If you're interested in the services that I offer, in particular the From Harm to Healing treatment program, please visit chrisjonestherapy.co.uk.